Ahlan wa sahlan, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. This is actually the last event that we're having this year at the Issam Faris Institute. We've had a full year and many activities, and we're pleased to take the summer off and give you a rest in the summer, and we'll be back in the fall with a new set of activities, including conferences and workshops and lectures and other things. And we're very happy to end our year. We saved the best for last. Well, we've had a lot of other good stuff too, but we're happy to have as our speaker today Anthony Shadid. Anthony has been a fellow this year, our first writer in residence fellow at the Issam Faris Institute, and this is a position we're going to offer intermittently to people that we think deserve it and who can make use of spending a year at AUB and in Lebanon to take advantage of what the university offers in terms of research activities and collegial fellowship and conversation with other scholars. And he's actually been spending the year working on a book, which he'll, I think, tell us about a little bit. But Anthony Shadid, in my view, is probably the best American foreign correspondent in the Middle East in the last generation or so, and I've known most of them, and many of them are my friends, and many of them are very good. But I think in the totality of his work, Anthony reflects that combination of insight and narrative journalistic skill and a feel for the place, which I think is very compelling in a foreign correspondent's work, to not just relay facts, but to relay a feel, kind of a mood of the place. And he's had a distinguished career in journalism, starting out with AP and then the Boston Globe and other places, and ending up now with the Washington Post, where he's been the Middle East correspondent for a few years. He was in Iraq. He wrote a book on Iraq, and he wrote another book on the Islamist movements in the region. And now he's working on his third book. And he'll be going back to Iraq later. He's been awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. So it really has been an honor and a pleasure to have him with us. And I've always benefited from our friendship. And now that he's grown a beard, we even start to look alike, which is nice. So with no further ado, I welcome Anthony Shadid, and thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you, Rami. I have to say it's a real pleasure for me to get to join you all today. It's AUB, I think, has a special place in my mind, at least, what it represents for Lebanon, for the Arab world, and I want to thank Rami and the Issam Faris Center and AUB itself for all the help and the support they've given me in getting a chance to work on this book that Rami mentioned. It's an opportunity that I think few writers have, and I'll long remain in gratitude for what they've offered. As Rami mentioned, the support of the fellowship has given me a chance to do the book that I'm working on now, and that I've wanted to do basically since I learned to write a sentence, and that makes me very appreciative. What I'm doing is I'm rebuilding my grandmother's house in Marjayoun as a way to understand what's happened to an older notion of the Middle East, as a way to understand what's happened to maybe what we might call an older notion of the Levant, one that embraced, or at least tolerated, ideas of diversity and cosmopolitanism, of identity that was, in a way, I think, defined in broader terms back then. And through that work and through the support that I've had here at the AUB, pardon me, I've also had the chance to spend a year with one of the most interesting cast of characters this side of the Litani. All of them eventually figure into the book. You couldn't ask for funner, more interesting, more hospitable people. There's one of my favorites, a guy named Nimr, who's a hashish-smoking ne'er-do-well who runs and hides when the water company comes to collect money from his house. And there's Hikmet, perhaps my closest friend, a man of pride and dignity who endeavors to be a zaim in a time that somewhat sadly no longer permits that. There's another character that I've come across, Dr. Khayala, who's a communist. He allowed his patients to pay him in kind with chickens, eggs, maybe olives, and he's now dying of prostate cancer. He's a urologist who's been killed by his own specialty. There's Cecil, a 90-year-old adventurer who once told me he lived the last whispers of the Ottoman Empire. And finally, there's Assad, a chef, who left Lebanon 30 years ago. He refused to be Lebanese, and he never became American. And together, I think they represent what's one of the most powerful narratives in any language, and that's identity, and the conflicts they inspire, and in a lot of ways the loss that they evoke. In that vein, I wanted to maybe do something different with the talk today. I don't want to try to speak with any sense of authority, trying to provide analysis and insight that would probably turn out to be wrong. I think a lot of you here, and a lot of friends are here, and I think a lot of you all probably know a lot more about the Middle East than I do. Instead, I want to, if I can, share stories and conversations with you, beginning with Iraq and Baghdad in particular, as a way to first, I think, understand journalism, the journalism that's been done over the years, but also to do perhaps something that's a little bit more profound. I think we're living, and I think a lot of us would acknowledge this at this point, we're living in a region that's changed irrevocably, I think. Yet I wonder if we fully understand what it's become. My favorite part of these talks is always the give and take that follows, and maybe when we reach the end, we can start that sort of discussion. I have to say there's a reason I'm a writer, not that good of a speaker, but I like to listen, and I'd be curious to hear y'all's thoughts on these and other questions. As I sat down to write this talk after Rami and I had discussed it, I think I was struck by the mistakes that we sometimes make as journalists. I think there are plenty of them, of course. But if I've learned something in more than 12 years as a foreign correspondent with the Associated Press and the Boston Globe and now the Washington Post, it's that the journalism that we can be least proud of is the journalism that comes from claiming to know too much, of acting like someone we're not. It's been almost a year since I was in Baghdad, where I'd like to start this talk, and much has changed in the country. I think in a lot of ways it's no longer the country that I used to know. And in my time there, starting in 1998, then again in 2002, and finally from 2003 into 2006, I often told friends that the longer I was there, the less I understood. I meant it as a joke, but there was a lot of truth in it. I did understand Iraq a lot less in 2006 than I did in 1998. And now I'm in a somewhat awkward position of knowing even less, having been absent from it for such a long time. If I knew little then, what can I claim to know now? Which I think begs the question, why should you listen to me talk about it? But let's give it a shot. When I was writing Night Draws Near, the book that I did on Iraq, I remember going through the articles I had written during the American invasion back in March of 2003. It was an interesting process, I have to say. The articles that I felt held up over time were the ones that gave voice to the people that I met there over those weeks, that described their sentiments, their fears, their hopes and their ambitions. The ones that felt dated and cliched were the ones where I, however tentatively, put forth my own views, when I said with too much certainty what I thought was going on in the country that wasn't my own. And with that in mind, as a way to address this nagging question of my own authority, like I said, I'd like to go back to those voices and those perspectives that I do think hold up over time, that are often as meaningful now as they were when I heard them a year ago, 2 years, even 5 years ago. And through them, I'd like to focus today on a single, somewhat sad idea, understood broadly. That idea is loss. To me, the overwhelming narrative of our experience in Iraq, and for that matter, my experience in the Middle East since 2001. Time and again, that's what I've encountered as a reporter, and no less importantly, as a resident of the region. Loss. I've seen it in Iraq, defined in so many painful ways. I've seen it in Lebanon, often poignantly in that weird interregnum between war and peace in which this country has lingered so long. And I see it quietly in Marjayoun, this small dying town near the Israeli border where I'm working now. And I think I learned to best appreciate it, the idea, in conversations I used to have with a man that I in time called a friend. His name was Marjayoun, and he was a bookseller in Baghdad. And looking back, there was one conversation in particular that lingers with me, that makes me smile when I recall it. It was a summer day in 2003 when Iraq was still filled with what were then the half-truths of occupation and liberation. It was before its nihilistic descent into carnage, that kind of mind-numbing violence that we see today. Hayawi was a bald bear of a man. He stood in his shop, the Renaissance bookstore, along Baghdad's storied Mutanabi Street. His store, with shelves 8 rows high, always had an eclectic mix. And that was part of my deep affection for both the locale and its owner. There were books by communist poets and martyred clerics, translations of Shakespeare, predictions by Lebanese astrologers, a 44-volume tome, actually 44 volumes, by a revered Ayatollah and attracted by the austere medieval thinker, Ibn Taymiyyah. These dusty stacks spilled across the tile floor, and in those cramped quarters, I remember this image of Hayawi trying to cool himself with a fan as sweat poured down his jowly face and soaked his blue shirt. Hayawi and I had met before the American invasion. We shared tea, scalding tea, and nearly a year later, he almost immediately recognized me after I walked through the door. Abu Layla, he said, it's the name of my daughter, and when he addressed me that way, I always felt more friend than reporter and more neighbor than foreigner. He then delivered a line he would repeat to me almost every time we saw each other in the next few years. I challenge anyone, Abu Layla, to say what's happened, what's happening now, and what will happen in the future. Hayawi would have a routine after he made an especially vigorous point like that. He would pause, drag on a cigarette, these strikingly dark bags always under his eyes. Then he would run his sweaty hand over his cheeks. And I heard this line uttered with a smile more than once. Does this look like the face of 39 years? And on this day, he offered that line along with another. He knitted his brow and he turned grimmer. We don't want to hear explosions. We don't want to hear about more attacks. We want to be at peace, he told me that day. An Iraqi wants to put his head on his pillow and feel relaxed. And what he meant was that he didn't want to lose anymore. What he meant was that he, his fabled city, his persecuted country had already lost too much. There are so many ways to read loss these days in the Middle East. In a way, I think Iraq is lost, and it's not in the physical sense of the word. A country that manages to show signs of resilience, but whose name still conjures up a collage of chaotic images, disturbing in their brutality and grotesque in their repetition. It's not simply the sense of American loss either, of the arrogance conflated with the ignorance that is helping this disaster about. It's painfully the cultural legacy, too, a loss that's still unfolding. In Arabic, Baghdad, the word Baghdad, always meant something more. It was greater than a place in its own way transcendent. There was a medieval city whose gates bore names that were simply sublime. There was the gate of the willow tree, the gate of the moon, the gate of darkness. And that loftiness gave rise to a word in Arabic taken from the name of the city itself. It remains one of my favorite words in the language. I like the sound of it, how expressive it is. Of course, there's no reason to use that description in the days I was there, and to be honest, I probably never would have learned it had it not been for a sculptor that I came to know in Baghdad. His name was Mohammed Ghani. And in the time I knew him, he used to mention the word a lot. And looking back, I guess it represented a certain nostalgia to him. It was around the time I saw The Bookseller. Ghani and I drove together in his car, and the image of him staring out the window at his occupied city stays with me even today. He kept looking in front, behind him, to the side, and I remember him muttering a phrase. He said it over and over, Allahu Akbar. From him on this day, it suggested resignation as we drove through the city. Across that car window past his city stories. Men sold jerry cans of black market gasoline along the curb. Vendors hawked cheap cigarettes, and trucks unloaded blocks of ice to keep food cold. The temperatures were 120, 125 degrees, and you could feel it. By that point, municipal services had collapsed weeks before, and they remain largely the same today. I remember U.S. soldiers in the street nearby. They were pointing their M16 assault rifles toward the cars, and a slogan was inscribed on the barrel of one of their tanks, "Love Machine," I remember reading. And as we continued driving through the city, the sculptor seemed to reflect. His lifetime had spanned the British occupation that ran from the end of World War I until 1932, the monarchy the British installed, the coups that followed, and finally Saddam Hussein's methodical ascent to power in 1979. And now the artist, the sculptor, was acquainting himself again with the city after having spent months abroad. He had left the city before the invasion actually began. He'd been too proud to admit that he'd been fearful. And now he was back with one war over and another one beginning. And I remember his words were unhurried, and their slowness felt to me like a narcotic on the chaos outside. I swear to God, he told me, Baghdad is a beautiful girl, but her clothes are dirty. Now, I had met Ghani, the sculptor, back in 1998 on my first trip to Baghdad. And back then I was a reporter with the Associated Press trying to make sense of Saddam's Iraq. He was a sprightly 74-year-old with bushy black eyebrows and a bald head framed by a mane of gray hair. And at a time shadowed by fear, he was someone who would speak with me. That was no easy task back then. Iraq was a rough place, dictatorial. A locale where caution usually meant survival. And he was cautious, of course. I remember he would turn up the radio in his studio to drown out eavesdroppers as we talked. But he still talked, and I always appreciated that. And I should mention here that Ghani was not simply a Baghdadi. As an artist a long time ago, he played a small part in actually defining the modern capital, his monuments, most in bronze and and built over 35 years, dot the sprawling landscape, drawing in what Iraqis like to still boast of their 11,000 years of history, Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Islamic civilizations. We drove past them on this hot day, and there was Ishtar, the Sumerian goddess, and Kahramana, the clever hero of 1,001 Nights. And before long, we arrived at another one that to this day remains my favorite. It was a statue of Shahrazad telling her stories across night after night. And there she stood as we drove the car over there, keeping vigil over once Libertine Avenue West Street along the Tigris. It was a mix, I thought, of what made Baghdad great. Its medieval glory was there represented by the statue, that fabled Abbasid Baghdad, with its unabashed self-confidence. And there was its modern heyday as well, a generation ago, represented by the street, Abu Nawas, once a free-rolling stretch of riverine parks, restaurants, and bars. And deep down, I think Ghani knew that both worlds were forever gone. All of this was gardens, he said to me, and that wasn't the case the day we were there. He looked out at the trash along with uprooted trees, discarded bricks, and rolls of concertina wire. The metal caught the sun's glint, and the barbs snared wayward rubbish. The scene was like Baghdad, I think, then and now, in flux and permanently out of order. Look at it, he murmured to me. No one takes care, no one comes. It was the first time since the bombs began, and he had finally seen his prized statue, the statue of Shahrazad. I'll never forget him breathing a sigh of relief. There was at least something still left, it felt to me. The Baghdad we were looking at was a lonely landscape. It was headed inexorably toward even more horrors than unimaginable. In the street, its secular, liberal, even cosmopolitan milieu was recent history. But as he looked at it, I thought there was a sense that perhaps not all was lost. Look how beautiful she is, he said to me. No one comes anymore, but Shahrazad remains. As he left, he went up to a young boy sitting under a cardboard lean-to, selling soft drinks. He pointed to the statue. Take care of her, he told the boy. If thieves come here, go tell someone. Don't let them take her away. So much, I think, has been taken away since then, both in Iraq and across a region wrestling with its own traumas, propelled and often initiated by American policy that, I have to say, from abroad feels singularly imperial. I've often wondered what it might have felt like to be in Berlin as World War II drew to a close, or in Baghdad as the Mongols approached in 1258. I wonder if the dread I so often feel in the Middle East is anything akin to that. Night Draws Near, which was the title of the book I did on Iraq, is more than a title of a book to me. In a way, it's the sense of the region I have right now. A year after these conversations that I'm talking about with the sculptor and the bookseller, I made a decision to move here to Lebanon, what I guess you could call my ancestral home. And it's from where I've tried to cover the Middle East for the past few years. And I have to say, for much of my life, living and working in Lebanon had been my goal. For so long, I think its elusive promise had represented what the Middle East might be, a cosmopolitanism that embraces its diversity, an intellectual space that celebrated criticism and critique. And I have to say, the Lebanon I arrived in from Iraq was one that's still brutalized by its civil war and blinded by that conflict's lack of resolution. I think as in Iraq, Egypt, and much of the Arab world, the cosmopolitanism of the bookseller and the sculptor were gone. And instead was nostalgia. And I think nostalgia is often simply an appreciation of loss and no more. You know, I've often wondered as a journalist or as a writer even, how you capture something so subtle. I've struggled with narrative that communicates these ideas, loss, nostalgia, and memory. I think it's probably the most difficult quality to understand about the Middle East, yet I think in some ways it's the most telling and the most important. Understanding people like the sculptor and bookseller was one way I could write about them, about the conversations with them, make them as human as possible to a reader. And through them we can maybe understand what we're losing in Iraq, Lebanon, and the rest of the Arab world. I think another way was to simply write about places. And indeed there are some places, I think, in the Middle East whose names suggest more an idea than a locale. A couple I've already mentioned. One is Mutanabi Street in Baghdad, where the bookseller was. Another is Abu Nawas. Cairo's downtown, Gropi Cafe, and the cinemas like Rivoli or Redland of another bygone era in Egypt. And then there's Hamra, the street outside this university, whose idea I think remains a special one to me. I think only this street could claim to have represented at one time the most sophisticated, open, and pluralistic space in the Arab world. And I'm sure it's an idea that's familiar to a lot of people seated here. You know, from the 60s until the Civil War in 75, Hamra's theaters and restaurants dominated Beirut's nightlife. AUB propelled its ferment and its cafes with its Arab dissidents, Palestinian exiles, and Lebanese of all sects and tendencies shaped an intellectual sanctuary that delivered a cadence, I think, to Arab politics. To me, it was the best of the Arab world, and in a way, its promise. I was once doing a story about Hamad itself, and I was talking to a 47-year-old filmmaker and critic about it. His name was Mohammed Suwaid, some of you may know him here. And as we sat in one of its cafes, he called it, in those days, back then, the Arab Champs-Élysées. And I still remember, he told me, that if you wanted to make a career as an intellectual, get involved in film, these are his words, the Hamada cafes were the best place to meet people and discuss. It was a meeting ground between the West and the Arab world. Of course, the Civil War ended that moment, and in time, Hamada's intersection was subsumed in Beirut's collision, much like Baghdad today. These days, of course, the street has shown signs of revival. I think we've all seen it. Life has returned, as has commerce, but I still feel it's a shadow, if that, of what it was. I think Hamada as an idea is gone, and so is what it represented. I don't think we can ever conflate cosmopolitanism with globalization. I have to say, I walk down the street often, if nothing other than nostalgia, and each time I walk down, I realize something that makes me very sad. I don't think there's any room left in Lebanon for it. Sadly, I don't think there's any room left in the Middle East for it. There's an irony that after so many decades of criticism in the Arab world of Israel's exclusive view of its identity, a Jewish state, the Arab world today is organizing itself similarly from Iraq to Lebanon and beyond. There are really no secular movements of import these days, the kind that once propelled it forward. Ideology has, in so many ways, I think, died in the Middle East, be it Arab nationalism, currents of the left, and so on. And whether their successes or failures, and there were many, of course, it was hard to deny that in them, in those secular ideologies, there was a universality that transcended the parochial identities of the past. And I think that's simply no longer the case. Politics are more and more reflected through an often unyielding religious discourse, or more primordial affiliations that break along religious sect and ethnicity. Lost is the notion of collective action, of uniting around principles or ideals. And in the end, you are left with communities that are bereft of citizenship, sadly small. Each community comes away with its own existential sense of itself, its very survival threatened by its own uniqueness. And I think U.S. policy, most spectacularly in Iraq, but also in Lebanon, Palestine, and elsewhere, deserves a large degree of blame for what's been unleashed. Even today, I think there's a cynical ploy by U.S. policymakers to fan sectarian hatred for questionable short-term goals. But I think the Arab world's complicit too, and I think it's a sad record for a region that was so courageous for so long in resisting colonialism. And I really leaves me with the question I often ask as I walk down Hamada, how could it exist today when its environment no longer does? And as I was doing the story on this, I was sitting with Suwaid the critic, I asked him that question, and here are his words. It's a good question to pose, he said, as we sat there. In a world where no one trusts anyone, talking about being cosmopolitan and open, it's a losing, his words trailed off. From them, he reflected on Beirut, Lebanon, and the rest of the Arab world, places like Mutanabi Street or the downtown of Cairo. It just seems out of place, he said. He considered that fate, and I think of his words often. It's nostalgia to me, he said. His voice was a little bitter, but even nostalgia has lost its meaning. I get bored of remembering the street. As I mentioned, I've spent the past year working on another book, the one that AUB and the Assam Feta Center have helped make possible. This one, of course, is a lot more personal. In a way, it's about Marjayoun, in particular my grandmother's house. As I said, I'm trying to tell the story of that rebuilding, along with the story of my family's departure from the house so many years ago. But it's also about identity, my own identity, and the identity of a region and a culture that's disappearing in less than a lifetime. In the end, I think I want to find out, if I can, if we can ever regain what was lost. Now, as many of you all know here, Marjayoun has a tricky reputation, a town that was perhaps, to put it mildly, too close to the Israeli occupation that lasted 20 years there. But I always felt that chapter of the history misses as a grander narrative. There's, of course, its beauty, something that I have to say I find breathtaking time and again. To me, trying to capture that's like trying to describe the color of the leaves of an olive tree. There's nothing masculine about it. It has this very graceful and gentle quality. But I think it misses, too, the fate of towns. Marjayoun, an example that are caught in these intersections of imperialism, conquest, and commerce. I've often read that when Beirut was a provincial capital at the turn of the century, Marjayoun was believed to rival it in size, which had 4 newspapers in its schools. English and French instruction remained the region's envy. For much of its history, it looked beyond modern-day Lebanon to Palestine, Jordan, and Syria. Beirut was, in a way, an afterthought. Life revolved around trading with less remote towns like Haifa and Damascus. And it's a story I think most of us know here. Lebanon's modern-day borders in 23 changed that. Even more so was the creation of Israel in 48. More borders were drawn with Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights in 67. During Lebanon's civil war, Marjayoun was run by a local militia, a little vaingloriously named the South Lebanon Army, and then Israel occupied it. Even today, the region around it still retains its diversity. It's Greek Orthodox, Maronite, Sunni, and Shia, and Druze, but only perhaps 800 people live as my neighbors in Marjayoun today, a shadow with more than 10,000 who called it home when my grandparents were there. House after house is abandoned, including my grandmother's. And like Hamra, it doesn't make all that much sense anymore. Living in Marjayoun, I realize it's dying. And what I'm witnessing there is the same process I saw along Mutanabi Street in Baghdad, Hamra, and Beirut. What I'm witnessing is in this small town is the same transformation I see elsewhere in the Arab world. What do I mean by that? Let me try to explain it. Marjayoun is a Greek Orthodox village, and I mention its sectarian identity only because of the politics of the place a generation ago used to mirror the politics of that sect. Before the Civil War, virtually everyone was what we might broadly define as a leftist, either communist or an adherent to the SSNP. The divisions were fierce, especially after a few drinks. Loyalists to each were known to sometimes slug it out in the streets. But in these days, as with Hamra and elsewhere in the Arab world, I think those ideologies have faded. Most of the old party cadres have passed away or given up on politics. And more people in Marjayoun identify themselves simply as Christian. That identification reinforces their minority status, and their specificity probably means their extinction. Maybe I could put that in more human terms. I once talked to a friend of mine, Hikmet, a person I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. He's become a good friend. He identifies himself forcefully as a Christian, but also as an Arab. And as we sat that day, looking out at Jabal al-Sheikh, the future was worrying him. The Christians, he said, were disappearing, especially from his village, our village, which, like I've said, is unquestionably in its twilight. We're the sandbags for the West, he told me. At the beginning of this talk, I'd said that I'd wanted to talk about loss, and indeed, that is what Abu Nawas, with its statues by Muhammad Ghani, Hamra, and its nostalgia, even Marjayoun and its faded glory represent to me. Of all those, though, I think I feel most keenly the loss that comes from my friendship with the bookseller, Mohammed Hayawi, whom I spoke about at the beginning of the talk. I think for brief moments in Baghdad, in my association with him, I saw life as it should have been. In a country that doesn't make sense anymore. I saw life as it could have been. And as I close, I'd like to share a small recollection of them, in a way a testament to that life. Hayawi had worked at this bookstore all his life. His father, Abdurrahman, opened it in 1954, and after he died in 93, his 5 sons inherited the business. Over the years, Hayawi and his older brothers would branch out. His family was Sunni, but that didn't really matter to him. He lived with his wife and young son in a predominantly Shia neighborhood. I think he took pride in his independence, in being someone who celebrated the gray areas, a reflection of the best of what the intellectual entrepot of Mutanabi was supposed to represent. It was on display for everyone, including me. In his bookstore, there were once banned titles by Shiite clerics imported from Iran. They vied with books by Muhammad Abdul Wahab and other austere Sunni clerics. Now, Prophet may have inspired that eclectic mix, but I always thought Hayawi seemed to be making a statement. Mutanabi Street, his Baghdad, and his Iraq would respect their diversity. The doorway of the Renaissance bookstore was always a border in that way. Outside were the sirens of ambulances and police cars. Gunfire was common. Horns blared in 2 lanes of traffic, one more than Mutanabi was built for. And inside, Hayawi went about his business as he had every day since he inherited his shop, guarding a sanctuary. The last time I saw him in 2005, he was sitting behind his desk, sipping a cup of tea that cost 10 cents. There was a pack of cigarettes next to it. And as he did every morning, hour after hour, Haji Sadiq, the money changer, ambled into the bookstore. Hayawi would always bellow, "What's the rate?" And Haji Sadiq would always answer, "I'm not going to tell you unless you buy." Hayawi waved to friends passing along the street outside. An elderly woman stood at the door asking for alms. Vendors entered offering everything from books to beach towels. And the day went on like this, in the rhythm of a life that now no longer exists, with a cadence that I'll probably never encounter again. 2 Kurdish booksellers came in bringing a gift of honey from Suleymaniya in the north. They greeted Hayawi in Kurdish, and then the conversation continued in Arabic. As I sat there, the money changer returned, quoting an exchange rate that had barely changed. The electricity cut off, with no one seeming to notice. Customers from Beirut in the north told the situation there, as did visitors from Basra in the south. And by afternoon, I remember the electricity finally came back on, and a water pipe was brought out. Hayawi dragged on it, and he was as relaxed at that moment as I think I'd ever seen him. Life goes on, he told me. We're in the middle of a war, and we still have a chance to smoke the water pipe. Last March, a car bomb detonated on Muslim Street, a few doors down from his store, the Renaissance bookshop. At least 26 people were killed. Another attack on another day, consigning yet more Iraqis to the anonymity that death brings there. Not all were nameless, though. I soon learned that Hayawi, this friend, was one of them. He was buried in the bookstore that always resisted the forces that had killed him. He was killed on Mutanebi, a maze of shops and stores housed in that elegant Ottoman architecture named for one of the greatest Arab poets, a street that itself spoke to another Arab world before these deprivations of intolerance, of imperial arrogance, of hopelessness and loss. There's a story that I find myself often turning to. It's about Baghdad's destruction more than 700 years ago. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, it was said that the Tigris River ran red one day and black another. The red came from the blood of nameless victims, and the black came from the ink of countless books from libraries and universities, the very stuff that made Baghdad one of the greatest cities the world's ever seen. On that March day, the bomb on Mutanebi Street detonated at 11:40 a.m. The pavement was smeared with blood, and the fires that ensued sent up columns of dark smoke fled by that same plethora of paper. A colleague of mine went to find out what had happened to Hayawi, the bookseller. He told me that near his shop, a little ways from the now gutted Shahbandar Cafe, a black banner was hung. In the graceful slope of yellow Arabic script, it mourned the loss of Hayawi and his nephew, who were, quote, assassinated by a cowardly bombing. I wrote a story about his death, and I wanted to speak about him today and to end with this today. His fate haunts me, and I guess if nostalgia is an appreciation of that loss, memory can be an antidote to it. But I realize that nothing will bring back the small moments of life that Hayawi represented. Hetzi Sadik and the tea, the bookseller and his water pipe. And I think those moments were gentle simply by virtue of being ordinary. I don't want to say those words again. They were gentle simply by virtue of being ordinary. And now they're buried in the rubble strewn along Mutanebi, a street that like Hamra, like Abu Nawas, and like Marjayoun, or that town in the autumn of its existence will never be the same. I think it's a life and a culture that I realize today can never be the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments, reminiscences? Riyadh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a very, very moving talk. I think you have a brilliant way of bringing the individual suffering and being able to express a wide political issue through the lives of individuals. And I heard you speak on NPR, I don't know, I think maybe 2 years ago, and you told a story where someone was given the choice of betraying his family by the American occupation. I don't know if you remember that story, but it's a story that, for me, will stay in my brain for the rest of my life, because it tells the horror of the kinds of choices people have to make, and maybe you'd be kind enough to repeat the story for this group.
Sure. Yeah, that was a story. It was 2003, a couple of months after after Saddam had fallen. It was in a small town along the Tigris called Dhul-U'ayya. Beautiful town. It was a beautiful setting, and it was also one of the places the Americans had began what they would call the counterinsurgency, and they went in with force. Again, this was early on. This is before anybody was even talking about an insurgency, and they recruited an informer, a young man named Sabah, and they put a bag over Sabah's head, and he went through detainees that were gathered under a hot sun and pointed out people who he said were working for the insurgency. Sabah's identity was eventually revealed. He was missing half of his pinky. People in the village recognized his gait, and there was 3 people had died during this raid, and there was going to have to be justice. And so some of the men that were in, there was a vacuum of power at that point, and ex-military officers, kind of tribal leaders, I don't know how we describe them, kind of filled that void, and they went to Sabah's father and said, either you kill your son, or we're going to kill the rest of your family. And Sabah's father was dealt with a choice that, is almost, it's hard to imagine any of us trying to face that. They did find Sabah, and they brought him back to the house, and he didn't know what was going to happen. And one morning, his father and his brother took him up behind and killed him. And I tell you, I wrote about it was when I interviewed his father afterwards, and I remember words that I don't think I'll ever forget. He said to me that not even the prophet Abraham had to kill his son. And I was so and at that point, I remember I knew my editors would ask me, you have to ask him if he killed him or not. And I remember that moment after he said those words to me that I couldn't ask him that, that you'd have to leave him with a little bit of dignity and a little bit of self-respect. And I never did ask him. Of course, my editors did ask me whether I asked him or not. But and I wrote about that story, and I mentioned it, like you said, on the NPR interview. And I tell you, what I often found in reaction to that story, and I found it kind of jarring and disturbing, was that a lot of people found this as an illustration of the brutality that we often see in Iraq today. And that disturbed me, I have to say. Because what I saw that as most powerfully a story about was this almost forgotten American intervention in a forgotten village, perhaps, and it lasted a few days, setting into sequence a chain of events that forever changed these lives. And I thought it was such an incredible example of how, of the unintended consequences of something like American intervention, military intervention, perhaps, and what they can do on the smallest setting, the smallest stage possible. And that's what I guess that's what moved me most about that story and trying to tell that story and convey it. But like I said, I think it was often understood in different terms.
Let me ask Anthony, the process of loss that you mentioned and the transition from cosmopolitanism, universalism to more provincial, narrow ethnic or religious identities. My sense is that this is actually a universal phenomenon, because I sense something very similar when I go back to Westchester County, where I was raised as a little kid in the 1950s, and we used to ride bicycles and go to the neighborhood store and buy 5 cents, we used to call them soda pops, and all these people were sitting around together, and it's very different today. Isn't this a universal process and that is happening all over the world?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's one thing I've been trying to kind of explore a little bit in writing the book in Marjayoun is understanding that this loss of a village, this loss of a town, is exactly like you're saying, is universal in a way. There is a universal story to be told about that loss. I think what's interesting or different maybe perhaps here, and again, I'm not an academic, I'm not an activist, so I don't want to speak with too much authority on this, but what I'm struck by, at least in watching events unfold and change unfold in Marjayoun, for instance, is you have this kind of sense of globalization and what its impact is on a town. I mean, it's a backwater at this point. It will be a backwater. But that intersects with these changing notions of identity, and I think identity in some ways is manipulated. I think it was very manipulated in Iraq, for instance. It also has its own inertia. And I think when these two things intersect, I think this is where we reach a much more, I think this is why it's a much more explosive situation in a place like here or elsewhere, that these things do come together. And like I said, I think identity is a very malleable notion, and I think these things do not come to the fore on their own. They're often manipulated, they're often used, they're often abused, and then there's also understandings that, in some situations, in conflict situations, I think any community will have a sense that they don't have a guarantee of survival, and that sets in its own sequence of events as well.
In a recent book I read about Iraq, what's it called, Imperial Life in the Emerald City, a fellow journalist of yours, the Washington Post, wrote an amazing story about the total bungling, incompetence, and arrogance of the occupation forces. I was just wondering if you were there at the same time this was written, and is that really as bad was it as bad as it was written about?
Yeah. Rajiv and I were in the same bureau. He was actually the bureau chief, and I was the correspondent in Baghdad over that time. So we both covered the same period in Iraq. And I think if anything, it was understated. I mean, it was a spectacular disaster. I think there was always a notion. But again, I come back to let me talk about that a little bit. I think we all thought, any of us that were covering this before the invasion itself, there was an idea that the Americans had some idea of what they're going to do in the aftermath. You thought that deep down, and then I think we were all kind of stunned and startled to see, that they had no idea that they were going to be an occupier, but didn't want. I don't know. It's how do I describe that? It was just an utter lack of planning in almost every regard. But I think there's a critique that sometimes can be dangerous, because I think that assumes that if the occupation was run better, it would somehow have been more successful. And I don't think that was the case. I mean, I think it was doomed in however it was run, however it was administered. And I was always struck in writing the book, and I think what Rajiv, explored a little bit in his book is, the unintended consequences that were unleashed by this invasion. This invasion is a catalyst of forces that were far beyond its, far beyond its purview. And I think that's what's still being played out right now. I mean, I think we're, on the verge of some kind of American withdrawal coming next year. We hear this stuff about the surge and of some kind of life returning to Baghdad, and I feel like we're in a weird interregnum, and we're waiting. We've seen that these decisive forces unleashed after the invasion in 2003, and we're about to see these forces, create a new, a new constellation of power in a way next year and the years ahead. Right now, I still feel like we're in a kind of a moment of waiting for what's going to happen.
And then here, and then back there.
Thank you for your talk. It was very moving. I was just wondering, you mentioned at the end that you mentioned memory, and as a way of dealing with nostalgia. Can you elaborate? I mean, are you talking about writing? Are you talking about gathering the kind of stories that you've gathered over the years?
Yeah, I think you can understand it at a lot of different levels. I'm always struck by the nostalgia that I've just come across as a reporter. And again, like I said in the talk, I think it is an appreciation of loss in a way, of what's been lost. And that's the way I've kind of made sense of it. But I do think memory, can be an antidote to the loss. And I'll speak maybe in kind of very just as a journalist, for instance. And I've always found journalism has its flaws. And I wouldn't want to be someone that wants to defend it, because but there's also great journalism out there. And I think the journalism that often does best is the journalism that gives voice to people. It gives voice to experiences, that it tries to portray things as they are, that tries to let voices speak rather than tell us what voices say. I don't know if that distinction makes sense. I'm trying to be a little more clear about it. I think the region, I think especially the Middle East, stories are often written about this region, by people who don't have a sense of this region. It's often written by outsiders, and those narratives are dictated by, and I would include myself among them, that don't have a real sense of the region. But the more I think we can do as reporters to listen, to convey those voices, to convey experiences. You run the risk of a story being a little too long and a little too boring, perhaps, but I think that's often the most powerful journalism, because it's the most sincere, in a way, and I think it's the most authentic. But it's not always that easy. I think what we're dealing with in journalism in particular is a limit of 1,200, 1,500 words, and there's only so much you can do with that.
I have a question about your experience in Iraq that is a bit out of the scope of what you talked about. What's your experience with events or attempts or whatever of suicide bombing in Iraq? Because I was reviewing some paper clip how journalism reported about suicide bombings, and I've read a lot, so my sample was really large, and what I came as a result at the end of my readings is that they have no idea. They haven't really figured out who those people are, especially in Iraq, who those people are, how do we stop them, how do you understand them? So what's your experience with this subject?
And I'll tell you, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I didn't, it was something you tried to report. It was often very difficult to report. Other people here who are reporters may know more than I do about the subject. The only thing I can maybe say that would be somewhat relevant to that point is that I think there was often a narrative that the Americans tried to push, that a lot of this was coming from people from outside Iraq, foreigners that were engaged in this, and I always thought that was exaggerated. Now, did they make up a greater number of the ranks of suicide bombers? Perhaps, but that I thought was more of a way to kind of for them to admit that an insurgency was a full-fledged insurgency would kind of go against their idea of liberation and their narrative of liberation. So it would be difficult. And I think there's a tendency to try to exaggerate the role of foreign fighters in Iraq. That's my only real insight into that, though. You probably, I mean, from your reading, you probably have a better sense of what the situation is.
This might be a big question, but what's your sense or your reading of the past few weeks in Lebanon in terms of Lebanon's trajectory of identity and memory and loss?
Yeah.
Do you feel it's a turning point, or is it very much a continuation?
Yeah, I guess in a political sense, I think that, like a lot of people have said, that we're in a truce that may last for, months, maybe a little bit longer. But I was struck, in just doing my own reporting after the agreement was, I think there was relief in the beginning that we weren't going towards civil war. But I also found within like 24 hours a lot of anger pronounced, anger that this crisis had to last as long as it did, and frustration with the political leadership that in a lot of ways manipulated this, this crisis and let it go on as long as it did to get, the most they could out of the crisis. But we're saddled with an electoral law that I don't think is going to change that, and I think we're going to be in a lot of ways in the same situation after the elections next summer that we are today. And that's a shame. And I think it was very telling that some of the harder negotiations at the end of Doha were about the electoral law rather than a division of power. I find that very sad. I mean, I think we're burdened with a sclerotic leadership that doesn't see a way forward necessarily, and it probably can't see a way forward just in the way they define their own power vis-a-vis their communities.
Thanks for the talk. I'm going back to Marjayoun. I'm trying to look...
Hold it in front of your mouth.
Yeah. I'm trying to look at how memory and loss are affected by more concrete socio-political processes. And I think Marjayoun is a bit different than other Christian villages in the area. There's more followers of a Syrian nationalist ideology, and in a way then probably it deals with memory and loss in a different way. Mm-hmm. Or it is, I don't know, creates loss. Maybe the socio-political process creates loss differently, or loss is seen differently because of that ideology. Have you looked into...
I think it's a good point. You're exactly right. I mean, it really was, Marjayoun was different than next door Leah, for instance. Back in that, even during the occupation, it had kind of a different relationship to the Israelis. What I'm struck by, though, is I think you're right. I think if those ideologies or kind of the past, it's communist or SSNP past, cast a longer shadow over Marjayoun today, I think it would be interesting to explore those relationships. But I'm struck by almost the utter lack of political activism ideology that you see in Marjayoun today. I mean, there's still, you still do see families that are identified with certain parties. Older members of the family will still, inside their house, talk about it. But Marjayoun is so striking to me in the way that identity has become reflected on itself. In other words, that, people have surrendered, a broader notion of collective action for this very narrow sense of being Christian and this sense of being threatened, this sense of being almost extinct. And that's what I hear time and again, that the town is dying, the town is over, there's no place left in southern Lebanon for the town. I find it a very sad narrative. And I don't see any attempt to kind of work against that either. It's almost kind of just watching it happen. I always think of this idea of autumn, the autumn of the town's existence, because that is what it feels like. That said, there are exceptions. There's no question about that. I mean, there was, the downtown in Marjayoun was hammered by the Israelis because there were still SSNP activists that were fighting in the town during 2006. But it really is almost, it hardly has an impact on the town anymore, I think, other than this idea, this notion of what it used to represent, what it used to be.
Anthony, you spoke of the sense of loss of these spaces and what they represent. I know you've done a bit of traveling and work in the Gulf, and I wonder if there's any sense that there's a replacement of these spaces in that the new projects that are happening there in the Gulf, and if you have any sort of thoughts on that, or is it just very artificial.
No, I think it's. I mean, I have to say, I'm fascinated as a journalist. I'm fascinated by Dubai, for instance. I think it's kind of a dystopic place, but I think it's incredibly interesting. I try to do a story on how do politics emerge in a place without politics in some ways. I mean, what issues do what do we organize around in a place like Dubai? Does it become workers' issues? Does it become right, citizenship, property? How do you get where do politics emerge in a place like that intentionally tries to create a place with no politics? I think with Dubai, it's something different, and it represents something different. But again, it kind of goes back to the idea that I was talking about Hamid. I think there's a big distinction between cosmopolitanism and globalization, and I think that's what we're seeing in Dubai is a globalized space that doesn't have these these ideals of diversity, tolerance, respect, I don't know how you define it, that a cosmopolitan ideal would necessarily express. And that may change over time. I mean, this may be a kind of a transition period, something more might come forward, but it's hard to see that, I mean, it's a place, bereft of citizenship, so you wonder what kind of stake people would have in that community in order for that community to develop and evolve politically. I don't know the answer to that, but that is the biggest feeling I have, is it is that we're creating spaces that are globalized but no longer cosmopolitan.
Can I ask one more question about your sense of how generally among American journalism policymakers, editors, the senior people in charge of journalism, the owners, the editors, etc., do you sense over the years that you've been in and out of the Middle East, especially the last 6, 7 years from after 9/11 in Iraq, do you sense any change in how at least the people you've worked with, or generally how people in the U.S. look to write about the Middle East? Do they understand more and more of these subtleties and these complexities, or is it still being reported broadly as a good guy, bad guy, our interests story?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure if I've read enough about, read enough to kind of answer that with any authority. I guess I can speak from my own experience with my editors, and I think, there's just in very kind of basic terms, I mean, there's definitely there's a loss of interest in Iraq, I think, at this point. I think we're going to see it fall off the front page spectacularly once the American withdrawal begins. I think there's been a lot more in the Washington Post, for instance. There's been a lot more written about the region. I mean, probably 10 times more about the region since 2001, but I'm not sure if we understand it, if our readers understand it any better at this point. Some of the frustrations I guess I've had in covering the Middle East are the same frustrations I had in the very beginning. I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to write fairly about Israel. I think it's you're writing against a narrative of a certain. I mean, I'm going to speak strongly here. I think there's a certain narrative of dehumanization that's gone on about the Middle East that you're forced to write about as a reporter. I think it's very difficult. We had a situation in Baghdad where we were told not to talk about these human stories or whatever. These ideas of bringing people there to life. It became more of a policy story in some ways. So, and I think these are they also go to the very constraints of journalism itself, and that we're dealing with an era where the idea of being a foreign correspondent, the way I've done it, is almost over. I think the people gathered here are doing it right now. We're probably the last of our generation. There are budget constraints. There's money issues. There's space constraints in the paper, and I think we've ended doing it one way, but we haven't necessarily come up with another way to do it. And there's a lot of talk out there, but I think in some ways the Middle East is still being covered in kind of a very basic, simplistic way, and I'm not sure the way to get out of that.
Last two over there.
I remember reading one of your articles for the Washington Post. I think it was an interview or a conversation, or I think it was a profile even, of Ghassan Twaini at the Nahar. And what I thought was really interesting is that the good parts, like the parts I enjoyed the most at least, were your quotations by him and how you portrayed his office even. And is that your kind of way of going back to giving, journalism, you said the right way for journalism is to go back and give people a voice. Is that an example, or is that a means to doing that, to getting into that process?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what I've tried. I haven't done all that well always, but I think that's what you try to do is let the the people you're interviewing speak for themselves. Let the scenes, it's just the basic thing that you're taught in journalism is show rather than tell. But I think with that Twaini story, that was the idea, was try to let this person's life or his experiences kind of drive the story forward. I think there's an important thing, and and I haven't got it right, but I think it's something you try to do as a journalist, and it's just not to say too much. And I think we always have a tendency to come out with a third or fourth paragraph that says everything, that's conclusive, and this is it, and World War III is around the corner. And I think the more we try to pull back and say it's really unclear, and there are a lot of forces here, and there's a lot of contradictions, and we're not exactly sure what's going on. I think the more we can do that, the more real it is, the more sincere, and the more credible it becomes. And I think, especially if I can give an example of reporting in Baghdad after the invasion, after the fall of Saddam, there was no dominant narrative out there. Opinions and sentiments were all over the place, and sometimes they're contradictory, and somehow you have to write the story to embrace that and to understand that and to capture that moment, because I think that tells us what exactly is happening. We can't say this is how people feel. Obviously, people feel a lot of different ways. So how do you capture that in the story? And then I think that goes back to what I was saying when Rami asked that question, is then you deal with the constraints of traditional journalism, that you have only so much space, and you have kind of a more traditional notion of how you tell a story, and that is you're supposed to say a lot as soon as possible.
Hi. I have one or two questions about the current book that you're working on, about the rebuilding of your ancestral home. Its primary concern is loss, and you seem to be wanting to record that loss in order to save it somehow. But whenever there is loss, there is something that replaces it. Do you see that replacement as unremittingly grim, or is there some form of some kind of transcendence and some kind of cosmopolitanism that remains and always will in this part of the world? Perhaps because it's an ancient tradition, I think, in this part of the world.
It's a grim story, which means probably 2 or 3 people are going to read this book. So, it has something kind of replaced what's been lost in that area. I don't know. I feel what that area, that kind of Wadi Taim area, that down in southern Lebanon, which is still a place of spectacular diversity. I don't know if something's emerging that is going to replace that, but I do think, I guess as I've tried to make sense of it in writing the book and researching the book and working on the book, is that, perhaps we, redefine our own identities. We understand identity in different terms, and maybe that's what we can take away that's somehow redeeming, that there's a certain redemption, and working against what, the way that identity has been redefined is in part responsible for the loss of Marjayoun in the first place, and that if there is a kind of a personal notion of redefining identity, in some ways that might be an antidote to it. But I don't know. I have to say, it's I think this is a book that is pretty unrelenting about about loss. So we'll see.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you all for coming.